My presentation is on the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement happened around 1950s to 1960s, and some people that were involved was Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, President Eisenhower, and President Lyndon Johnson. The two presidents I will later mention in my other slides. Martin Luther King Jr. was very involved with this movement, and he fought against discrimination and segregation and fought for equality. Selma to Montgomery March was in 1965 that Martin Luther King Jr. participated in, and he was also known for another march called Walk to Freedom, and he also delivered a speech, his iconic speech called I Have a Dream, that was inspirational for the people. And then Rosa Parks was well known for her refusal to get off the bus when they were segregating the black and whites on the buses, but so the black people had to sit in the back and white people had to sit in the front, but she sat in the front and refused to get off the bus when they tried to remove her. So my first key event is the Jim Crow law, and this was in the 1800s to 1960s, and the name came from a comic from Thomas Rice. This Jim Crow law was a state and federal law in order to enforce segregation and discrimination. The Jim Crow law was after the Reconstruction era, and the white people wanted to continue having more power and advantages while black African Americans were taken away from their rights, and the white people wanted segregation in public places such as bathrooms, churches, schools, transportation, water fountains, and etc. And they wanted mostly everything separate. And another thing that the white people were against was interracial marriage and voting for African Americans. And in order to keep the segregation, they had a couple ways to discriminate in voting: by literacy test, which was a verbal and writing test that was almost impossible to pass, and poll taxes, which were fees so that if they can't afford it, they weren't able to vote, and the grandfather clause, which was only a leverage for the white people. And in order to keep segregation, the Jim Crow law was strictly enforced in the South, while in the North it wasn't a law, but it still did affect the African Americans. And then the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896 Supreme Court was the case that allowed discrimination and segregation to happen because they used the word, quote, separate but equal to make it sound constitutional, but it was not. Next, I have the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1964. I combined these two because I thought they were pretty relevant to each other. In 1957, it focused more on voting rights and getting rid of voter discrimination. And it was the law was signed by President Eisenhower in 1957 on September 9th, and this finally gave voting rights for all, especially for African Americans. And then there was a U.S. Commission on Civil Rights in place so that anybody who tried to get in the way of fair voting and was prosecuted or faced consequences. And then in 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the law on July 2nd in 1964. This finally, it was a bit more broader than the act in 1957, and this finally ended segregation in public and banned discrimination and equal employment and protected voting rights for all. So, lastly, I have the conclusion. And so, the civil rights movement brought major changes to our society and in discrimination, segregation, racism, and many The individuals that stood up and fought for justice and equality back then are why we are able to have our society today be against discrimination and racism, and we are taught in school or in education that racism and discrimination is wrong. So we have a changed mindset, and although racism is shown in some instances, and there are still some people who continue to be racist, but it is not as severe or violent as it used to be back then. Thank you.